We're joined today by Matthew Herder, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine with a cross-appointment to the Schulich School of Law. He's also a member of DAL's Health Law Institute, the Nobel Tech Ethics Research Group, and the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology's Health Policy Translation Group. Now, Matthew didn't want me to tell you all that I'm about to read here, but it's so cool, I have to say. So before arriving at Dalhousie, Matthew was the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation Legal Research Fellow at New York University School of Law. He also taught law at Loyola University Chicago, worked at the Federal Court in Ottawa, and articled at McCarthy Tittle in Toronto. He holds a Master of Science of Law degree from Stanford Law School, LLM and LLB degrees from Dalhousie, and a science degree from Memorial University. Currently, Matthew is the PI on a 3-year operating grant entitled Emerging Health Researchers and the Commercialization of Academic Science, funded by CIHR. And of course, Matthew's one of the researchers on the IGNITE team looking at societal issues related to orphan disease health. And today, Matthew will describe findings of a network analysis of both publications and patents in the field of Alzheimer's disease and genetics. We'll be looking at a publication data set that encompasses approximately 90,000 researchers publishing between 1987 and 2012. Matthew's examined relationships between researchers' participation in patenting activity and their position within publication network over time, and will explore the implications of commercializing research for scientific collaboration. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Herder.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you everyone for coming. This is wildly outside of my comfort zone as a lawyer by training who's dabbled in empirical research here and there, largely with the help of others. And I really want to stress that without the help of others in this case, this project would have never come to pass. It's still very much a work in progress, as you'll see. A few in particular to mention: Sarah Vizentini was a research assistant here, working with Anatoly Gru's lab at Dalhousie, the Information Management School. Their knowledge and expertise around bibliometric studies, network analysis were critical to getting this project off the ground. And the work we'll do in the future depends critically on that relationship. So I'm indebted to that, as well as the help of my collaborators on the CIHR grant, in particular Janice Graham, who's here at Dalhousie, Brian Noble as well, Tina Piper at McGill, and Kelly Holloway, a postdoctoral fellow, working with us in that project, that larger project, which is really trying to examine through a variety of means the impact, if any, of commercialization broadly understood, not just discrete sort of things like a patent application, but relationships with industry, shifting norms within academic science, a variety of ways of looking at this broad problem of commercialization and trying to understand what's happening. And so this is one project that we've undertaken under this CIHR grant that we've received. I should also say in this particular project that we've benefited hugely from Dr. Sultan Darvish's expertise and knowledge of the field that we've chosen to focus upon. We're happy he was able to join us today as well. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a project that is a work in progress, and to some extent, or to a large extent, it tests my comfort zone. Let me start with something that's a little bit more comfortable for me, giving you a bit of a policy story about where we are and the present sort of emphasis upon commercialization. And that story really starts, or all started with a congressional hearing in the United States, and these two individuals, Senators Birch Bayh, which is on the right, your right, and on the left, Robert Dole, Bob Dole. These senators were appearing before a committee in Congress that was thinking about a piece of legislation that would transfer ownership, intellectual property ownership, to academic institutions and to other recipients of funding, rather than having the government own that kind of intellectual property when it resulted from publicly funded research. There were some exceptions, some government agencies that actually already did that prior to this law. These two senators were pushing for, but for the most part in the United States, government retained ownership over intellectual property like patents prior to 1980. So the senators appeared, and their central argument in favor of this legislation, which would take on their name, was that the inventions that resulted from federal funding were languishing in university labs. They were not being commercialized. They were not being further developed. They said that according to a 1976 report completed by a US government agency, about 28,000 patents that the government had funded that were still in force were basically sitting idle. They were not attracting interest from industry. And that was the reason why we had to adopt this measure, this legislation, and transfer ownership to the academic institutions who would know what to do with it, who would be better positioned to sort of steer the commercialization of those inventions. They quoted in support of this argument the fact that of those 28,000 inventions that were then in existence and the subject of a patent, only 1% of them had actually been licensed out to an industry partner, licensed out to the private sector for subsequent development. What they left out, of course, is that 17,000 plus of those inventions were in fact inventions that industry had taken a look at and had passed on. The vast majority of those 28,000 inventions were the result of research funded by the Department of Defense, which was one of the outliers at the time. They had the power to transfer, or people who received funding from the Department of Defense could seek ownership over any resulting intellectual property. So it's not surprising, given this selection bias, that only 1% were actually the subject of further commercial activity, because these were things that were, for the most part, or at least a large chunk of them, were uninteresting to industry. Industry had taken a look and had passed. So the point of this story, and this story though, which that sort of actual factual understanding of what the stats really showed, which these two senators neglected to highlight in their opening testimony before a congressional committee, that story got lost. And we got a piece of legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act, where the facts rather got lost. And in my view, there have been sort of a number of decisions at sort of high levels of government, but also quite local at the institutional level, in favor of pursuing commercialization, basically on the strength of that same argument. And yet, we have a lot more evidence. This will be the first evidence of the Mac to PC sort of snafu, where on one side of that jagged line you're supposed to see the word evidence, on the other side you're supposed to see the other words, where I think there's been a bit of a disconnect that's evolved between what we know, what we knew then, and what we've come to know about the impact of commercialization and how to go about it, whether it's likely to succeed, and the decisions that are made at the institutional level, at governmental levels, and so on. And so this talk is really an appeal through sort of an in-depth examination of one particular field for greater attention by members of the research community, by institutional decision makers, research funders, and government as well, to pay a lot more attention, I think, frankly, to the sort of growing body of empirical literature that tries to figure out what the impact of all this commercialization activity really is. There's actually, I would sort of separate this growing body of literature into sort of two broad categories. Again, the screen doesn't make clear my intention on this slide. On the one hand, you have a lot of evidence about the impact of commercialization, or the emphasis placed thereon, on whether we actually see more things being commercialized, right? So whether the means we've chosen to do this, which is primarily a reliance upon intellectual property, primarily patents within intellectual property, to try and encourage more commercial development, is that actually succeeding? Other kinds of intellectual property as well, which I'm happy to talk about. And then there's a whole separate body of evidence, they're related, but it's generated separate research questions, separate methodologies, that tries to examine whether it's succeeding or not in terms of achieving more commercial development, what's actually happening to scientific practice in the meantime. Is it shaping the way that researchers do their work, who they work with, how they go about it, the kind of questions they select? So there's two sort of quite big literatures at this point in time that provides us a substantial body of evidence to think about when we're making decisions related to commercialization. Okay, so that's my general appeal of this talk, to sort of encourage us or particular individuals and others to think a lot more about the growing body of evidence around commercialization. I'm going to give you some of the literature that we have as a start to provide some context, and sort of in keeping with that distinction that didn't appear on the slide, but I was trying to draw between evidence about are we actually succeeding in getting more commercialization, and on the other hand, well, what's happening in the meantime? What's happening to academic practice, research practice? So I'll give you that, some snapshots of some of that evidence, and then I'll move in to talk about Alzheimer's and genetics research and the project that we've been sort of undertaking under the grant for the last couple of years. Okay, so let me talk about some evidence about whether we're actually seeing more commercialization. We're certainly seeing a lot more activity, right? If you, by almost any measure, we're seeing more patents, more applications for patents, more companies being formed, more deals being struck in respect of all of that intellectual property. But it's unclear about whether we're actually seeing more things get to market. That's actually a very hard thing to see, to determine whether those outcomes are actually real. And some people have actually raised significant questions about whether seeking more intellectual property might actually slow the commercialization process. An incredibly influential study was done by Michael Heller and Rebecca Eisenberg, not a study, a paper that was published in Science in 1998, where they framed this idea of a tragedy of the anti-commons, invoking Garrett Hardin's paper from the 60s, some of you might recall, The Tragedy of the Commons, overuse of a public resource. This was the opposite. Let me try and walk you through that idea. Their basic idea was, if you think about commercialization as a process from a basic discovery, an insight, a piece of knowledge, towards some kind of product, some kind of saleable thing in the marketplace. If you have this sort of growth of intellectual property rights upstream in that translation process, you're in effect creating a bit of a thicket. Each one of those patents, which I've represented as these little scratches on this slide, is in theory a person you have to get permission from to do research if your work might overlap with what's covered by their patent. And so if you have this growth of upstream intellectual property rights, you could impede that translational research process, right? And that leads to what they called the tragedy of the anti-commons, where you have this proliferation of private property rights at the expense of actually knowledge translation. That idea was incredibly powerful. This is one of the most cited papers I think you're going to find in science, and it wasn't written by scientists, a couple of lawyers. But people have tried to figure out, well, does that very sort of elegant idea have any real purchase? And so a number of different studies have been done. The first and perhaps most noted are surveys done by John Walsh's group at Georgia Tech of scientists to actually ask, well, are patents creating problems for you? And in a series of surveys, they basically said, even for academic scientists who are engaged in drug discovery, so very applied, where you'd expect a lot of intellectual property rights, academic scientists report essentially they don't run into problems, right? These patents don't seem to interfere. They're not bogged down in the kind of negotiations that Heller and Eisenberg's tragedy, the anti-commons, would predict. In other words, scientists actually find ways to work around patents that might be in their way, or frankly, ignore them. We may not, the lawyer in me may not suggest that that's a wise strategy for all kinds of reasons, but empirically speaking, it appears, based on those surveys, that the tragedy of the anti-commons is illusory. But other studies suggest something quite different. And so some economists, most notably Fiona Murray at MIT, have taken advantage of what actually happens in the real world in terms of patenting something, the sequence of events, to figure out, well, what's happening in the field. So just in case this isn't familiar to everyone, the typical sequence of events in a research lab that leads to a patent is roughly as follows. So you have some kind of discovery that you think is worthy of publication. Before doing so, if you think it also has some kind of commercial relevance, you might file a patent application. And Technology Transfer Office officials will encourage you to do that before you publish it, and publishing it includes talking about it at a conference and so on. Then you file on the same essential piece of knowledge, you'll typically, if you're an academic scientist who cares about publishing, you'll publish that as well. There's nothing to stop you from doing both of these things. But a patent is something you apply for and don't get as of right. You actually have to persuade a patent office in a given country that what you've done meets the criteria of a patentable invention. And so typically this takes a fair bit of time, 3 to 5 years, and a fair bit of money, usually around $50,000 in legal fees and so on, going back and forth with the patent office to show that you've sort of satisfied these criteria. And so you have a patent that is quite often granted a couple of years after the paper, the same sort of research that was embodied in a publication comes out. A patent is granted a little bit after that. The application preceded that, but it's not public knowledge, at least for about a year and a half. And so the economist, Fiona Murray, had this insight, well, if the same knowledge is in both a publication and a patent, what happens when the patent is actually granted and it becomes a legally real thing, a legally enforceable thing? We predict, if the anti-commons idea has any purchase, that citations to that paper would actually drop once the patent has been granted. Right? So if you see that sort of dotted line, you'd expect citations to the paper to be going up and up and up, assuming it's a interesting insight that's embodied in the publication. And then if you're worried about infringing the patent that exists in respect of that same piece of knowledge, then you'd expect those citations to go down, right? People are worried about using knowledge that they may not have the permission to use. And so these researchers, it's a bit tedious to explain how they construct these, but basically in 2 separate studies, one sort of a pilot, very small, they looked at 169 patent paper pairs, and then in the second case over 1,000. And so these are pairings of patents and papers that by certain criteria basically cover the same core knowledge. And they looked at this very thing of what happens to citations. And in both cases, they found that citations, consistent with the anti-commons prediction, the citations did indeed go down. And they went down as a function of the complexity of the number of patents that exist, the type of discovery, so they looked in particular at cancer-related genes, and they saw these effects. So to put this together with the surveys by Walsh, it's quite confusing, because if scientists are actually ignorant of most patents that are in their way, then why are they observing these decreases in citations? I should also add that they're controlling for the expected decline in citations due to the passage of time, right, through the statistical procedures that they used. And the decline occurs despite independent of the passage of time. So there's sort of some mixed evidence about that. The strongest mixed evidence about the anti-commons idea. The strongest piece of evidence that I'm aware of, looking into does seeking intellectual property of some kind actually facilitate the commercialization of that knowledge, is this one study done by Heidi Williams, another economist who's in the Boston area as well. And she looked at not patents, but secrecy or confidential research agreements. In particular, she looked at Celera, Craig Venter's company, and its decision to keep secret for about 2 years human genomic data while the public project was making that available. And she tracked what happened to the different sources of knowledge and which was more likely to be integrated into a diagnostic test as a result of which. And her findings were quite dramatic. Right? So if you had data that was actually made more available, it was far more likely to be integrated into a diagnostic test. So, these are studies about one particular thing, but at least in this case, it's not about patents, it's about agreements that preserve a degree of secrecy. It seemed to inhibit commercialization, not actually facilitate it. Okay? So, the evidence regarding what's happening, are we succeeding in achieving more sort of commercial end products, it's very unclear whether the means we've chosen actually achieve that end. But there's also a body of evidence that is quite mixed as well regarding the impact of all of these practices on academic or research practices. Again, we have different methodologies that have been used. So one popular or big concern that was raised was that these new commercially oriented activities would crowd out traditional academic ones. Think about teaching or publishing. And so another group of economists has actually looked at this question of, if you participate in patenting more, does it crowd out the publication output that you as a scientist have? And they found quite the opposite, right? These two things tend to correlate very positively, according to this very big study of academic scientists. But they found at the same time that the focus of those publications, and they had to do this in a fairly crude way, but look at the kinds of journals that the articles appear in and tracking keywords that correlate significantly with things that are more likely to be patentable. They found there was a modest shift in the content of publications. So patenting and publication output went hand in hand, but the content of publications seemed to shift, according to the study, towards a more commercially oriented research program. And this is going to be the segue to the work that we're doing that I'll present. And this is a study that was done by Tanya Bubla at the University of Alberta, where she looked at all of the Canadian researchers within the stem cell network. And she looked at those researchers and their position with, you can't see it on this screen very well, but this is a graph of, and all the sort of lines connecting dots are co-authoring relationships. So people who have, over time, members of the stem cell network research community in Canada, worked together and worked with other people. Their group mapped out all of those interconnections and then looked at individuals' position within their network on the idea that that means something in terms of their level of collaboration and so forth, in light of how much do they patent, have they been involved in founding a startup company, for example. And I think quite surprisingly, contrary to the previous study where patenting and publication output seem to go hand in hand, in this case, people who were more peripheral members of the network were the ones who were more commercially oriented. So this study came out in 2010. So a lot of the evidence is quite mixed, as I've said already. I don't think that means we shouldn't be paying our attention to it and sort of throwing our hands up. I think there are really different trade-offs to be thinking about depending on the type of intellectual property, and probably huge differences depending on the area of science. And so there's a lot more literature than I've shared with you by way of context, but the findings certainly underscore that it's not as straightforward as we might have imagined in terms of facilitating commercialization and perhaps not interfering with academic practice. I think there's at least reason to believe that there are very real trade-offs present in some fields. Okay, so that motivated in some ways our grant as a whole, but also this particular study where we wanted to look at one scientific field and see what was happening in relation to the commercial behaviors that we could easily track. And so we thought about following Bubla's work because it seemed like a fairly novel finding, and seeing if we could see that in a much larger data set. And so we chose to focus for various reasons on the field of Alzheimer's disease and genetics. That field, as I'm sure many people in the room know, goes back several decades. Right now, probably started with Glenner and Wong's paper in 1984, and there have been a lot of activity, a lot of support in terms of funding that's followed. Through a sort of very arduous, painstaking process, consultation with various librarians, a content expert, Dr. Darvish, we came up with the following search string, which I'm happy to talk people through during Q&A. I won't for the sake of time. The thing you might note for the time being is that we added a third sort of limiting set of search terms where we were looking for things that at some point in the article a connection was made to possible therapeutic relevance, diagnostic relevance, some kind of treatment for Alzheimer's in light of the research that's being done around the genetic underpinnings of that disease. So we didn't capture Alzheimer's research in genetics that had no mention whatsoever of the potential benefits that could come from those insights, but this is still quite a broad net. This was meant, because it is such a massive field, to reduce it a little bit to the people who are doing things that are a little bit applied in nature. This resulted in 31,000 plus publications. And then because we're interested in this relationship with the commercial activity, we basically executed the exact same search with the help, I should say, of the tech transfer office here at Dow, the industry liaison office, using their sort of proprietary patent database. We ran the same search in that database called Delphion and found, as you would expect, and I can explain why if people are curious, a sizable but much smaller number of patents based on the exact same search criteria or search terms. We had to search different fields because patents are not publications in terms of their structure, and I can explain why these were the fields we focus upon if anyone's interested. But still quite a large number of patents that met and were relevant in light of our search strategies. The biggest challenge, and why the stats that I'm going to present are extremely preliminary, has been that we've been stuck in the process of data cleaning for quite some time. A year and a half of my life that I won't get back, and I didn't even do most of the tedious work, or much, if any of it. But if you're not familiar with these kinds of studies, the big problem you're worried about is making sure that the people you're identifying and then situating within this network that you're generating or hoping to generate is that you might actually be lumping individuals together who are not the same individual, but their names are similar, or splitting individuals who are in fact one individual, right? Because in some publications they've included a middle initial, and others they haven't. In some publications they've misspelt their name slightly. And you can imagine those kinds of challenges of disambiguating names get particularly challenging for non-Western names in particular, right? So our search was capturing all English publications, but obviously the people involved globally in this field. And so there was a massive challenge in terms of disambiguating names. We did a lit review to see how people solve that. They tend to solve it by not dealing with it, or using various scripts to try and automate some of that process. We used a little bit of automated decision making, but for the most part we did this by hand. And so we feel like we met and exceeded the standard in the literature by a significant order of magnitude. And so as a result of this incredibly long process, our publication data set included about 90,000 people that we believed were unique. About 6,000 of those, despite additional searches on Google trying to figure out, did this person change institutions? Is that why their affiliation is different? All of that information came with the names that we culled from Web of Science. And we got it down to about 84,000 unique scientists that we are quite confident we know that they are different or the same, as the case may be. In the case of the patent data set, so about 3,000 patents, where the norm would be to have far few humans named on each patent. It's not like a scientific publication where you might have 50 authors in some cases. Because of the way patent law works, it's very rare to have more than 2 or 3. So we have a much smaller number of people in that patent network that we also constructed. So unfortunately, because of the size of this and the limits of PowerPoint, I can't show you in depth what we've been building. I'd like to do this again at some point, where at the social media lab you can actually zoom in and pull up names and see who's working with who. That's not something that's available to me through this software. But I'm going to walk you through the network, just the publication network first, and then I'm going to overlay the patent network on the publication network, and you can start to see some of the patterns. This is going to be very descriptive, and I apologize again, you're basically not going to be able to see it. I've blown up certain subgroups at times just to give you a feel for things, but you're going to have to take my word for it and take to heart my appeal to pay attention to the evidence and the work that will be coming from us, I guess. So the papers go back before 1990, but I've just started at this stage. Very small number of people that are showing up. You can see sort of, I don't know if it's even visible, but there are some that you can't see any names. That these are groups of people, and if there's a line between a point or a dot that's discernible to you, each of those points is a person again, and the line means they've co-authored together. So nobody here has co-authored with anyone here. And the names show up because we've made them show up for people who've got more co-authoring relationships. Okay? So you can see it, you'll just start to see, and this is going to be entirely descriptive, just sort of walk you through how there are clearly more people getting involved in this field of research. And then a few times I'll mention some specific names that, that will hopefully resonate with some of you that have knowledge about this field. So you can see in this case that there's a group that's starting to be a sort of fairly sizable cluster with a group of bridging individuals. There's Christine Van Broekhoven is a significant researcher who's in Europe, who's doing a lot of key work. And so she's sort of one of the key bridging individuals between this cluster, and that cluster over there. So I'm just sort of streaming through the years. In this, by 1993, it's difficult to see, but John Hardy is right here. Some of you might be familiar with that name. He's a significant individual in that he not only collaborates with many people, but he bridges sort of one very important cluster by that point in time with these others. St. George Hislop, probably the most noted Canadian researcher in this field, is in this group. His name is incredibly hard to pick out. Again, if we had different software, I could blast that open and show you all of the relationships. And so the field just keeps getting bigger and bigger. By this point in 1995, you'll start to see the formation of a sort of dominant cluster, and this is sort of that image enlarged. Some of the names will be familiar again. Gerald Schellenberg, who's in Seattle. We sort of walked through this with Dr. Darvish to some extent, and you can really start to see patterns form. And you can also, what we're going to do in future steps is overlay sort of these patterns and clusters that are forming with significant achievements in the field. We've begun that process, but as different genes are discovered, late onset Alzheimer's disease versus early onset Alzheimer's disease, you can see these clusters actually form, and it has real world validity in terms of who's working with who. So again, this is sort of 1996. You see that cluster is starting to become more apparent in the middle. A lot of individuals. By this point in time, for a name to appear on the slides, it means that they have co-authored with at least 30 different individuals. So, you know, these individuals, maybe it's just 3, it could be multiple papers with those same 3 people. And there could be people who've published quite a bit in some of these larger groups, but for their names to appear, they have to reach that threshold of 30. You'll just sort of see the same trend continuing. There's nothing in the geography of this, right? So a person who's here is no more removed from this than a person over here. These are just disconnected from the main cluster. You can start to see other clusters that are significant but not part of the main cluster, so we'll be able to interpret those in terms of the area of research they're doing. You can start to see by the late 1990s that although there is this sort of dominant cluster of individuals working together in various ways, that there are also sizable clusters outside of that. And the trend just sort of continues until about 2001, where, and I'm hoping this is just visible to the naked eye, it seems like there's a bit of breaking apart within the community. So we want to try and make sense of what was going on. Was there a drop in funding across the board? Were there significant divergences within the field in terms of which way is best to proceed? But the connections become less dense in the early aughts. And Hislop is right in the middle of that. So this part here, that's Hislop essentially. So it's going to be very interesting because there's a lot of qualitative material about progress in this particular field. There's at least 2 books that have been written about the various races that were ongoing that we can kind of make sense of why these clusters are forming and breaking apart and so on. So this is all the late 2000s. The field is just really growing in size, and you can see that the center is getting larger and larger and larger, and you've got lots of people whose names appear So they're highly collaborative individuals in the center. By 2010, which is the third to last year of our data set, the individuals have to have at least 100 co-authors in that year to appear in this data set. So it's just becoming quite massive by this point in time. Okay, so that's just when we share this with Dr. Darvish, and hopefully when we share this more and more with others in the future with knowledge of this particular field, I think that sort of tracking patterns in terms of the science that was being done is going to be very interesting in and of itself. Who's working with who? When do those things tend to change? All those things we want to explore a lot more. But obviously, given the context I've given you, we're quite interested in how this relates to the commercial activity that's happening alongside of this. So we wanted to explore those relationships between the co-authoring patterns we've been tracking over time and the co-inventing patterns we've been seeing over time. So the network, I'm not sure I actually clearly explained this, but the network that was constructed from the patent data, anytime someone is an inventor on a patent and they have a co-inventor, it's not just themselves as the inventor, that relationship would appear as a line in the same way that a co-authoring relationship does. And so it's going to be a little bit complicated to walk you through this, but basically we had to look at this year by year because the co-authoring data set is so massive that we had to break it down by year, particularly in the last decade or so. In 2012, there are about 19,000 people who are unique, who published in that year in the co-authoring data set. The vast majority of those individuals had never had a patent and up to that point in time. Our patent data is not divided year by year, it's across all years. There were 486 people amongst that 19,000 who had a patent in some year, 2012 or prior to that. Which means that of the 6,100 or so people that appear in our patent data set, they would appear either in other years in the publication data set or not at all. Because in fact, only about half the people who patented ever published across the entire time frame, right? So the networks are different just on that very basic level, but there is a 50% overlap, and then it's spread across different years. So what you're seeing in this graph is our first overlay of the two networks. In this network, all the people who are on the outside and appear in a very, to you, faded green and blue are people who do not appear at all in the co-authoring network. So these are people who've patented and are amongst the 6,100 who've patented at some point, but have never published. The red people are people in the co-authoring network, but who've never patented. Okay? And then the green and blue that you're seeing within this broad circle, right, so there's like a cluster of blue individuals there, and you can start to see some of the green dots embedded in the turquoise. These are people who have patented to different extents and appear within this network. Okay? As a first statistical test, and we're literally working on this for the first time in the last few days, so this is very preliminary findings again. We just compared the people who appear within the network this year who patented to some extent during their careers or who have never patented. So basically, everything inside of this outer periphery of green, we compared all the red dots to all the other colored dots. And there's a hugely statistically significant difference between the two. And so with network analysis, you can track various different things. The most basic of which I've been hinting at all along, is how many co-authoring relationships do you have? Or whatever relationship is defined by a link between the two nodes. And so here, and they call that the degree centrality, right? The extent to which you have a lot of co-authoring relationships. The mean degree centrality for red dots is around 20. The mean degree centrality for dots of any other color is around 44. So there's a much higher level of co-authoring relationships amongst people who've patented in this year, amongst the 486 people who have. We then did an ANOVA, an analysis of variance on 4 different treatments. So the people who've patented, as they fall into different degree bins. So we're treating their level of patenting as an attribute of the nodes, the dots within this graph. So how sort of commercially oriented are they as tracked by patenting activity? The people, again, who are in blue have patented a lot, and the people who have, in the green levels, have patented maybe a little to a more moderate level, and the people who are in red have never patented at all. And what we see is, again, a very significant relationship between the mean degree of publication, patenting activity, and the dependent variable being how much co-authoring relationships they tend to have. And so you can see from this graph here that the folks who have patented an awful lot have a much higher likelihood of having a high number of co-authoring relationships, and the people who don't patent, that's less the case for them. Interestingly, this is the median, and so instead of the mean, and the middle of the sort of gray shaded bars is where the median is. And the median actually in the no patent folks tends to be a little bit higher than the others. And we think that's driven by the sort of very high likelihood of outliers in the blue group in terms of extremely high publication counts. And you can sort of get a sense of these findings from the dots. The individuals that are blue and green tend to be part of the core, whereas you see very little evidence of blues and greens who are just sort of on their own amongst the outer periphery of the red, right? So the blue people are very likely to either be embedded in a group that's maybe a little bit peripheral but very dense, or in the main cluster. And they're much more likely than the average red people. And so we've tracked this, again, just preliminary findings back in time for the last decade or so, and basically the same trend continues to hold, where you expect that the people who are patenting a lot more, you don't expect, but we are seeing that the people who've patented a lot more tend to have very high degree centrality within the publication network. I won't walk you through all of those, but basically these graphs show something very similar to 2012. My working, we haven't, just literally as a function of time, been able to go back earlier to our data set, and my working theory would be that we're actually going to see a change over time, because as I'm sure many people in the room are aware, patenting has become a more common activity. And so my working hypothesis is that you might expect a different relationship in the 90s, early 90s in particular, maybe even the late 80s, where the people who are patenting more may be more outliers within the publication network as well. But for now, the preliminary finding that we've come up with is that people who are, there's a strong positive relationship between the patent position that these individuals occupy and where they fall within the publication network. I didn't take my time and go through it that carefully, but some of the people who are in the middle range of patenting level, their degree centrality fluctuates over the years. So there might be different relationships depending on whether you're an extremely high publisher and can patent as well versus sort of a more intermediate level publisher and take on patenting or don't. So if we think about how patenting is more common across the board but still relatively rare within a scientific career, unless you're going sort of, you're an elite superstar with funding all the time or to a great extent and publication that matches that, publication records that match that, perhaps the relationship is more complicated than this very positive one we seem to be seeing. So next steps, we're going to be looking at this discrepancy between the mean and median and seeing whether it's outliers that are really driving that. The data that I showed you for people who have really nitty-gritty statistical questions is both unscaled and weighted. So weighted tries to give credit to the people who might have many different publications, but it's with the same individuals. We think it's going to be important to look at how many of those co-authoring relationships are with unique individuals in a given year. And so we're going to do some additional statistical tests to take that into account. It's unscaled at present, again, just for reasons of time. We haven't used as a denominator, if you like, the changing size of the network over time. And so we need to take that into account and normalize the scaling and scale the relationships that we're seeing. there's a lot of different directions that we can take this that I've hinted at already. I'll talk about a few more and then stop, and I'm sorry I've taken this long. In particular, we want to look at some other measures of that a network analysis has sort of built into it. The one I've talked about so far is degree centrality, right? Just measured as a raw number of co-authoring relationships. There are other measures like betweenness centrality. So are you a sort of a key bridging individual? Think of John Hardy that I sort of blew up earlier on and talked about how he bridged two different clusters of research. Are those individuals the ones who are also patenting a lot or not? There's also this confounder of time in the case of patents, right? So our patent network and the attribute of how much they patent is across years. We didn't look at changes in researchers' position within the publication network before and after they began to patent a lot. It seems to be that as sort of in total, after patenting a lot, those individuals seem to be very highly placed within the co-authoring network. But is it more disruptive along the way? Does it change depending on the level of publication output you seem to have? More interestingly, I think, are to get into sort of theoretical questions about what work patents really do. The dominant discourse is to frame them as assets, as tools to commercialize and steer further research. They also can play a much more sort of social role in terms of opening up new lines of communication between researchers, between people who maybe don't publish a lot, or just companies. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether the links between people who appear in both networks, the publication network and the patent network, are actually the same. Are they the same individuals that they're already working with in terms of co-authoring publications, or are they new individuals? So this will allow us to get into that kind of question as well. And because of the richness of the sort of scientific literature and the people who've sort of canvassed important developments in the field, and now that we've built this quantitative data set, we're going to actually be able to look more carefully at the outcomes of different paths of research in light of these commercial measures that we can track. There's been a lot of failed clinical trials. There's really only 4 drugs on the market for Alzheimer's at this point. And so there is a lot of sort of failures in a crude sense to this research, but it'll be interesting to see sort of how research directions changed, whether the commercial measures were able to track not just patents but funding sources, which we'll build in the future, whether they help predict, explain, make sense of those changes in the field over time. Last slide, and just for fun, it's wonky again. The major limitation, of course, is that these measures that we're using of co-authoring and co-invention are just measures of collaboration and commercialization, and there are many others that can be used. I think that our study has a lot of potential power because of its scale. There's been nothing like it in the literature to date, but of course there are lots of caveats around, and we can only see what we're tracking in the first place. So on that note, and thanks to all these individuals, most of whom I hope I've mentioned to date, I'll stop there and ask for your questions.
Any questions? Yes.
I'll just yell. Hey, Matthew, I was wondering, in your list of authors, did you just focus on people in academia, or did it also include people that were working for companies like GSK or Pfizer?
Good question. We captured everyone who published, period, regardless of affiliation. We built into our data set and tried to extract affiliation information, but Web of Science, which is the best database, really only organizes affiliation information neatly from 2007 forward. Right. So we'll look at about 5 years because we're interested in did people move around, that kind of angle as well, but we can only do that over a smaller time frame. But regardless of affiliation, are they academic or not, if it met our search criteria for a publication in the scientific field, they were in. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Hi, Susan. Oh, hi, Susan in Newfoundland. And I have formerly worked with IRAP for 15 years, and I'm just curious about if you have any sense of the level of interest from private industry in the kind of work you're doing.
I don't have a sense of, and I think I've scared most of industry away from other work I've done. But I would say, though, that at least for larger pharmaceutical firms, there's an incredible appetite for this kind of set of metrics. And it's probably far more sophisticated than what we're doing, so they may not be interested for that reason as well. In terms of tracking patents by competitors, tracking people who are publishing in the field, there's it's sort of called something intelligence, and there are reams of economists and so on that help companies to actually build this kind of information. I don't know that they're asking the same kind of question, but their data sets are impressive from the little snapshots we've had in the published literature. Good question, though.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think everybody thinks they know what the answer is going to be. They think they know how everybody else is going to respond to it. So it's something that people, I think, have been afraid to ask for a long time. But I think the nuances are going to be really important as we move forward. So it's very interesting work.
Thank you.
Hi. It was quite interesting to see over the period of time the network grow. And I was wondering whether you think that's a reflection of, you said that this sort of was a field that began in 1984, and is that a reflection of the growth of a relatively new area of research over time? And if you took something that had been 30 years old in 1984, would it also have that depth of network? Or do you think that's a change in the pattern of research that's been taking place over the last 30 years, that all research, even if you took something that was relatively novel discovery, is going to tend to have a more networked publication pattern because authorships on papers at the moment, I mean, I think our last paper had 25 authors on it, and the next ones that are coming out are similar, just a different type of publication. Can you comment on that?
Karen, are you asking us to build a whole new network of an entirely different field and see if there's...
Well, I guess one thing that you might have noticed, for example, just within your data, is that perhaps papers that were published in 2000 tended to have 5 authors, and papers that are published in 2012 might have tended to have 25 authors. Did you kind of notice a change in this, that type of a change that you think covers,
So,
that reflects a change in the types of publications, or do you think that, funding models, for example?
So we very much want to interpret the sort of the quantitative picture that I presented in light of what was happening in terms of funding, in terms of patient organizations that were forming. And there's a fair bit of literature that sort of talks about developments within this field. I have no reasons to think specifically whether this field will be different than others. And I'm sure some of the norm changes in terms of number of people on papers would probably cut across scientific domains, given the move to larger teams generally and so on. So we didn't try to track that specifically, although we tracked quasi-related things around, because we're interested in career stage issues and participating in commercialization activity as a junior researcher versus a more senior one, and whether those experiences look the same, understood in different ways. And so one of the measures we did build into our data extraction is the position of these authors on papers. I'm not sure we have within that, I can't remember whether we captured the total number of authors always, but if someone was a first or last author, we've encoded that. So that's another attribute that we're going to either control for or look at to see does the experiences of them as high publishers, high patenters, is it moderated or amplified by their general authorship position? It doesn't get at, the size of team growth. Has that changed in this field more than others? I don't know. But we just sort of, the hardest thing has just been the data cleaning, and we're just getting going on what can we do next. And actually we'd welcome ideas from people in related fields or different fields who are quite interested in sort of the development of an area of research. And we're going to go after more funding to support that further work. So I'd love to get thoughts and input later if that's of interest.
Matthew, it's Chris again. One of the things I was thinking about just now, because I didn't ask it the first time, was the slopes in terms of patenting for people in the private sector versus the public sector, because I know the thought process is that, having been sort of one foot in both for a while, behind when you patent and why you patent tend to be different. Maybe looking at the slopes of, people in the public sector, how often they patent versus people in the private sector, I would suspect you might see very different slopes, because the impetus to patent and then following through on those patents to actually get them examined and then hold on to them over time is a whole different ball of wax, right?
Yeah, and so for the people that we have good affiliation data, we could actually at least take a random sample of people who are in academic institutions and those who are not, and maybe the hybrid individuals as you characterize yourself, and try to explore those different things. It won't tell us anything about their actual motivations. We could theorize about them, but that's where the follow-on qualitative work would have to happen. In one of the books that's sort of told the story of the races, Alan Roses, who I guess is still at Duke, was at Duke when he did a lot of the key work. He talked about how they were filing patents because there was so much sort of trickery happening in the peer review publication process, where people were delaying their reviews, withholding research materials, that the only way to sort of stake your claim was to file a patent and get priority, right? Which is a very old use, but you hear it voiced in contemporary settings as well, to the patent system, right? To beat others to it. Not just actually to have a patent so that you can do something commercial with it, but that you can actually claim that you discovered that thing. And so it's really interesting as we pour into the literature around the field to sort of overlay that on what we're seeing in this very reductionist, frankly, approach. And think more about what other questions we can ask of this data, or what other kinds of data we need.
Any other questions?
Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.